Welcome to the third installment of the All Things Fall Protection podcast, brought to you from the Diversified Fall Protection headquarters in Westlake, Ohio. There have been questions asked from clients asking if they need window washing anchorage systems. This seemingly simple question requires a complex answer. To help break this question down, we have the window washing experts from our partners at Peak Fall Protection, Travis Nelson and Ben Copeland. Even before we get into the nitty-gritty of window washing anchors, what are questions that you would ask to ensure that the client really does need a window washing anchored system?
So first and foremost, just to determine that they have needs for suspended access, because windows can be cleaned from the ground, they can be cleaned from lift. There are various methods for cleaning windows, but if suspension is required, then there is some need for a certified anchorage system to support suspension.
I mean, typically you'll find that most window washers can reach up to 3 building levels with a water-fed extension pole. That's so long as they either have the ground surface below them or a large enough surface to get that pole up to the level and service those windows. Above 4 levels is typically where we'll see suspension often be preferred to, obviously trying to reach it from the ground. And oftentimes where lifts are difficult, maybe there's a grassy area or some landscaping in place where a lift could not be reasonably accessible without causing damage. Suspension is often the most cost-effective means for reaching those areas.
So since we've identified the needs for the window washing, how do we then determine the best product for the type of roof they have?
Sure. So there certainly are a variety of roof types that might dictate a specialized anchor point, but most of the time for window washing anchorage, it's more dependent actually on the structure of the roof than the roof itself. And so it's important for us to know what is holding the building roof in place. Is it steel? Is it concrete? If it's steel, what type of steel? And the locations of those structural members will dictate what type of anchor is required, how many, and where they're located.
The roof composition is important in terms of sizing the anchor, but regardless of the roof composition, there can be an anchor designated according, and typically these are not custom applications. Often a standard anchor can be retrofit regardless of the roof type.
What makes for a quality window washing anchor? Can you paint a picture on how that would look?
Sure, and I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of times fall protection anchors look generally the same. One manufacturer may make something that looks a little different than the other, but most typically we're looking at a galvanized post, a galvanized base plate with some type of connection to structure, and most often some type of stainless steel connection point at the top of this post. That's the point of connection for the user, of course. And the construction of this is built for corrosion resistance because it's galvanized steel. It's designed to handle the elements. The anchor is also built to resist a 5,000-pound fracture load. But what happens below the anchor is also important. And so when you differentiate one manufacturer from the other, it may not be so much differentiating their actual post as far as the full service of that company. What are they providing? And so it's not just the anchor post, it's the connection to structure. It's how they can maximize efficiency of the system as to reduce the number of anchor points required while still providing a compliant system. In other words, proper design. Analysis of the building structure below, which varies, but to ensure that there's adequate support from the building structure itself, not just the anchor, so that the composite assembly can meet that 5,000-pound load capacity, because the building structure can really depend. Ben can elaborate.
Yeah, absolutely. And once you determine that proper building structure, the connection details might vary. And even if you engineer the details properly, I would say installation is also a key to ensuring that a window washing is installed in a compliant manner. So you might have a joist detail that requires some reinforcement, some bridging to an adjacent joist to resist the torsion applied load. Whereas on a large concrete cased beam or even a large steel beam, you may not need need all of that reinforcement. But in all of those applications, you have to ensure that any component on the underside is installed properly. The anchor is going to look the same once the roof flashing is installed from the rooftop, but the user can't see the roof. They can't tell if those bolts were tightened correctly, if that distribution beam that spans to the adjacent joist is actually installed properly. And if any one of these components is not completed through our turnkey process and installation is done poorly, that can make a great, well-engineered anchor either fail load testing or worse, fail in a real-life application.
So what you're saying too is, as we touched on in another conversation we've had in the past, it's like a really big tree, but itty-bitty roots versus that big tree with those big roots that can keep the foundation strong.
That's a great visual. I mean, you could have something that looks extremely stout at eye level above the level of the roof, but what happens below is just as or more important because it's what you can't see and inspect. So it's really critical to ensure that that's done right the first time.
Does it really matter the size of the building? Like, can you have a one-story building that needs them, or is there a certain level? Because I know OSHA has all these different parameters and guidelines and regulations that, it's 4 feet higher for one, 6 for another. Is the same with buildings? Does that fall into the same parameters for that?
Sure. So, as I mentioned before, we typically see the majority of window washing systems required over 4 levels. So 4 levels and beyond, they really can't practically be accessed by the ground, generally by anything other than a lift. And again, you get a few more levels beyond that, you're talking a pretty sizable and expensive lift to reach these levels. So there would be some applications where a building with less than 4 levels could have suspended access, potentially for facade maintenance, or if there's areas that are just tricky to get to, but we most commonly see access for 4 levels or above.
So just to recap, there's not a certain height of a building in which case anchors are required, but more so just the need for suspension. And even one thing, like for example, on a 3-level building, if there's sunshades, the sunshades would prohibit the window washer from being able to reach the glass with a pole because the sunshade projects out. In those cases, the facade might need to be accessed by either a lift or by suspension, just because they can get up close to the glass, reach in with a short pole via suspension. So there's sometimes extenuating circumstances. It really just depends. There's not a trigger height as there is in general fall protection that would require anchors to exist.
So we know we need anchors. Our building's the good height. We don't want to trample our flowers outside with a lift. We like the structure the way it looks out there. When you guys start the process, how do we know what the actual spacing is determined on the rooftop, and how do we know it's going to be safe?
This is really just a function of ensuring that the window washer can access the building using proper rigging techniques. And these are defined within OSHA 1910.27 as far as rope descent goes, also known as bosun's chair access. And there's some commentary to that standard that further defines what compliant rigging is. The spacing is not something uniform, such as 10 feet on center or 6 feet on center. It very much depends on the anchor's setback from the building edge. So, for example, as the anchor is set back further from the building edge, the spacing can increase. And the reason for that is that the usage area for an anchor is based on angulation from perpendicular to the building edge.
I would agree, and the one other factor that adds on to that is the location of the building structure. So if we're attaching to concrete or cast in place, you can very literally go straight from that angulation. But again, the spacing might be either increased or decreased just based on available steel structure if you're trying to hit a target concrete beam or otherwise.
So based on that knowledge, I'm a customer. I know I need roof anchors. I've contacted you guys to come out. I don't have drawings for my building. It's an older building. Can you walk me through your process and how you go about getting the information needed to make sure that those anchors are in the correct spacing and installed correctly?
Yeah, so the building structure is very important, and the first thing that we try to do is encourage the building owner or property manager to look for those drawings. And we've had success in additional incentive and encouragement to find those drawings, whether it's reaching out to the original designer of the building, so the architecture engineering firm, digging through their files, maybe clearing off an inch of dust sometimes from these drawings who've been sitting down in a basement somewhere. And if we can find drawings, it is by far the most efficient way to review the building structure and coordinate an anchor layout beyond that. If that's not available, we would move to what we call either a hazard analysis or a structural survey, and that's where we're actually sending an inspector out to map the structure for our anchor layout needs. So popping ceiling tiles, looking up above to see, is it joists, is it concrete, are there beams, their spacing, their size, and essentially relaying all the information a structural drawing would normally have so that our team can then design the anchor layout to suit.
Digital drawings are great. They really streamline the process. Unfortunately, that's just not always the reality. And sometimes we're working with drawings from 1942 and they're not fully legible or they're not even fully correct. But any information is better than no information. And like Ben was already saying, you at that point just fill in the gaps that you don't know and perhaps complete some confirmation type visits to ensure that what's shown is accurate. And it really would depend. Like a building that's built with steel construction, we were referring just a minute ago to the spacing of the anchors. Well, it's important to know what the spacing is. It's important to know the composition of the roof so that the anchors can be sized properly. Whereas in other applications, such as a cast-in-place concrete type construction, there may be more uniformity as far as how the anchors are going to mount to the structure because perhaps there's a solid 8-inch slab throughout or a 10-inch slab throughout. In that case, the structural survey could be a little more straightforward. But regardless, we have to get to some comfort level that the design team can designate in each area, we can apply an anchor here, complete a design, and ensure proper certification of the installed system.
So just a same topic, just different question. And I'm sure you guys have seen this in the field. Someone has a large HVAC unit on top of their building. Can they use that to tie off to? Is that safe?
Yeah, good question. We get that a lot, and it really depends because there's a couple of type systems that you would see as far as HVAC, and one would be a system where there's steel dunnage that supports the HVAC unit. And some of these can be very heavy HVAC systems that are supported with heavy gauge steel frames. And in that application, it's possible that that steel frame could be used for incorporation of an anchor. And this is very ideal because that's potentially one less point through the roof that requires a flashing. So it can be a very cost-effective way, and that should absolutely be part of any fall protection study to first utilize components like that rather than roof-mounted anchorage points when able. But it's not always practical. It depends on the size of the steel, and in some cases, there's not a supporting steel frame. Rather, there's an HVAC system that is built on a curb. And those applications, we don't at all suggest direct rigging to the HVAC system because essentially what you're doing is wrapping a rope around it, which becomes questionable as to the integrity and the load capability, but it's also creating a horizontal lifeline unintentionally, which is a totally different load scenario and not one that's typically going to be designed for a 5,000 pound ultimate applied load, which is an anchorage requirement.
When we're completing an installation and reviewing existing dunnage or existing exposed steel that might be certified for use as an independent anchor point, each point, we'll call it, whether it's a steel column, whether it's a steel frame, has to pass load testing, and that's designated on system certification drawings as an engineered, tested, and certified anchor point. So window washers are not able to go out onto a roof and start self-designating engineered anchor points. Every exposed steel dunnage, member or otherwise, should be tested and certified just as we would any other anchor that goes through the roof or is connected to a wall or another member to make sure that it's certified. And the window washers know that that point, that specific member, is able to be used for suspended tie-off.
Being with all that information you just said, does it matter the methods of the suspended access for the different types of anchorage? Do I need a different anchor for each different type of suspension, or are they all able to be used for all different kinds?
Yes, it does potentially matter. For rope descent systems, which is the 1910.27 standard, which is fairly new, we're typically dealing with rigid anchorage points that have a connection point on top for direct connection for equipment and safety lines. Those type anchors can also be used to support other rigging operations, such as power platform. And power platforms often referred to as swing stage. Those terms are synonymous. But when you utilize rigid anchor points to support powered platform operation, you also need to integrate a counterweighted outrigger. And that is a heavy and portable piece of equipment that can go onto the roof area that can project and support equipment lines that then support the powered platform. However, those must be tied back to certified anchorage points. Those anchor points can potentially support either type of rigging, but then there's also davit bases, Ben, if you want to touch on that.
Yeah, so another way to suspend a swing stage is through a davit assembly system. So that's different than an anchor. It's basically the davit base acts as a receiver to a socket, and that socket acts as a receiver to a tall mast with a boom that sticks out anywhere between 5 and 8.5 feet over the building edge. And it will actually pick the stage up from the ground and act as that direct suspension tie-back point. Now, the users on that stage will still have to be tied back to typically an independent roof anchor. That would be any other roof anchor that you could use for bosun's chair access. But that davit provides the primary means for rigging that stage. And there's a couple different versions. You can pick it up from the ground, or in certain situations, you can actually swing that stage onto the roof. It's called a roof rig system. But when you're working on a stage, if you have a two-man stage, it means that 2 men are working on that stage. Your davit arms would suspend the stage, but each person working on that stage would have to be tied back essentially to a tie-back anchor, and that's an independent roof anchor. Can't be the davit assembly, can't be the davit base. Has to be an individual tie-off point. Typically U-bar or roof anchor, that is acting as that personnel's safety line in case the stage were to collapse or have an issue.
So you said tie-back anchor a lot in that sentence. What is it? Can you define that for us so we know exactly what to look for and what it would be when that process comes?
So the term tie-back anchor can be used to represent either tie-back for a user's equipment line or a tie-back for a user's safety line. And each type of system, be it powered platform or bosun's chair / RDS, either type system requires both an equipment line and a safety line. And in each case, there must be 2 independent points of anchorage. But either one of those anchors could be referred to as a tie-back line and would typically have a 5,000 pound ultimate capacity. For a rope descent system, that's absolutely the case. For powered platform, there can be some variance. It depends on the rated load of the equipment, and there could be some variance as to the davit assembly rated load, for example. But tie-back anchors will always have a 5,000 pound load, and they're connected to structure, tested, and certified per OSHA.
And an important note about a tie-back anchor is it is for one person at one time. So you could not have multiple users attached back to the same tie-back anchor. Similarly, you couldn't have one tie-back anchor being used for suspension while at the same time being used to provide rooftop fall protection for someone working on the roof.
What if the tie-back anchor is rated for 10,000 pounds? Then could 2 people use it or not? Or would that be just such a huge anchor that...
It could, yeah. You don't practically see that, but it can happen. Yeah, it can be.
But you
designed
would create a huge hole.
You would have and it's more like, can the structure support it more so than can we design the anchor.
And you would typically, where you see that, we've done it a few times, you would still have 2 independent tie-off points, so we'll call it 2 independent U-bars on the same post.
So one of the questions that I've heard a lot is, hey, we already have anchors. How do I know they're OSHA compliant?
Sure, so the building owner should be able to provide the contractor, the window washing contractor or facade access contractor, the certification documents that go along with that system. And that's a letter of certification stating the anchors have passed load testing. This is for specifically to RDS. And typically as-built drawings showing the locations of those anchors, and generally some typical details will be present. In order to maintain that certification, the building owner should also be able to furnish any type of annual inspections that were performed. So if a system was installed and certified 3 years ago, it should have an annual inspection report or certification that would accompany that documentation stating that that system is still in compliance.
Ben covered that very well, and just to read verbatim right from OSHA, 191027 indicates the building owner must inform the employer in writing that the building owner has identified, tested, certified, and maintained each anchorage so it is capable of supporting at least 5,000 pounds in any direction for each employee attached. So, long sentence there, but it's saying some very critical items. One, that the anchor be identified. And Ben touched on that. How is it identified? Well, not just that it's present on the roof, but in some type of as-built drawing or layout that corresponds to the actual anchor layout that's on the roof. This gives the window washer some assurance that this point that he's looking at on the roof corresponds to a drawing that indicates that these are certified anchors. And most ideally, there be some type of detail that further keys the window washer to ensure that that specific location is one that has been certified and identified. So identification is important. Testing, of course, is critical and a requirement, and it should be completed, by the direction of a qualified fall protection engineer to their discretion, and that may vary per site depending on the existing conditions, but it's absolutely a requirement prior to use and goes in tandem with the certification process that's also indicated here. And then last there is the maintenance of the system. So not just that it's been installed and certified properly on day one, but from that point forward that there's been proper maintenance, that there's been annual inspection, which is referenced further within this OSHA standard, that there has been continued documentation as to the compliance of the system. So that really needs to be in place. All of those are important variables that are called out specifically by OSHA to ensure that the system is actually certified for continued use.
If a team comes to a building and they notice that they don't have any of that information, and they say we have to get these windows washed, but we're not safe going up there, how quick is it to get someone from your team to go out there and do a certification?
Yeah, so it depends. If they're just missing an annual inspection, that's a much more brief process. So let's just say there's a gap between certification and the current date. That's something that our team, just knowing the general scale of the project and the building, would be able to quote and oftentimes have an inspector out the next business week, if not the very week after, depending on geographical location. We're pretty quick on that. We like to be pretty quick, and that's most often when this would come up. When a window washer goes to wash those buildings, it's due, and they realize that their annual inspection has lapsed. The second case we would come across is there's either no certification on file or that certification is out of date. As Travis mentioned before, the testing requirement is more time intensive than an annual inspection, actually going out and applying a load to each anchor to verify its capacity, and obviously creating the drawings and the certification documents to suit. So again, we would need to understand the scope, the size, the type of anchors, the systems, our davits involved, et cetera, and then be able to quote on that. Typical turnaround time from date of notice, I would say would be anywhere between 4 to 6 weeks with closeout documentation. But given the customer circumstance, everything can be expedited. But it's just a longer process, so it takes a little longer to work its way through.
And I would also say, excellent question by the window washing contractor, because it's a clearly an OSHA stated requirement that the window washer request that documentation and that it be on hand and the certifications be apparent prior to starting work. So the fact that a window washer is asking that question speaks to their professionalism, speaks to the fact that they're representing not only their own employees, but also the building owner's portfolio, the building owner's liability to ensure that it's one more person that is coordinating to make sure that things are documented properly.
You just said a big word, liability. That's a big word in a lot of these OSHA conversations and fall protection pieces. If there is an OSHA citation, who is liable for a window washing incident related to improper anchors? Is it the building? Who is it?
Yeah, great question. We get that a lot. And it really, of course, I hate to say that it depends, but to some extent it does depend. And it would depend on to what extent the parties that are identified within the OSHA standards, to what extent have they acted on their requirements? And to what extent have they met those requirements? And for example, if the building owner has presented the window washing contractor with documentation that speaks to the certification of the system, that speaks to the system being identified, inspected, and so on, and then the system is misused, that's a totally different situation than a window washer coming on site using anchors that have not been certified, and then perhaps there's an accident related to the capacity of one of the anchors or one of the components on the rooftop. Perhaps it's not even an anchor that has been used for anchorage. And so it really is going to depend as to what level of documentation. And that's why OSHA speaks to not just documentation, but written documentations. The transfer of these files is important. The upkeep and digital representation of all these files is a really critical part of the process.
Travis, Ben, thank you both for your expertise on window washing anchors. If there are any further questions about window washing anchors, you can reach out to Travis and Ben at anchors@fallprotect.com. Remember, we want everyone in the field to stay safe and come home just as they came into work each and every day. Thank you all for tuning in to the All Things Fall Protection Podcast.